All right, Trev, let's start off in your famed NFC South. What were your big takeaways from this Carolina-New Orleans game?
I mean, it's if you want to know what my big takeaway was, it was that I think Panthers fans are so ready to be relevant that they I'm not saying all of them. I don't mean to totally generalize, but I think a lot of them were not ready to accept where the Panthers currently are. They're not ready to compete. Nothing about that roster, unless Bryce Young was about to just become an absolute savior from play one. That roster is not where it needs to be. And it's kind of sometimes hard to see that when you're in the middle of it. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina right now, so I hear a lot of talk about the Panthers and what they're doing. And there's a lot of players to get excited about. Brian Burns, Frankie Louvu, Jeremy Chin, Shaq Thompson, Derek Brown, obviously Bryce on the offensive side of things, DJ Moore before he got traded. But there's a lot of players that you could point to that get you excited. Carolina is not a full team yet. Certainly not on the on the offensive side of things. It's nowhere near where it needs to be for Bryce Young right now. And Bryce Young is certainly not perfect. You can definitely tell that he's a little bit hesitant right now, whether it's his size related or not. He seems a little bit hesitated. He realizes that he's not on an Alabama team that's absolutely stacked. There's no receivers in there that can help him outside of Adam Thielen, who, if Adam Thielen was what he used to be, I feel like the Vikings would not have gotten rid of them, because then they immediately needed a good wide receiver too when they did. So that tells you where Adam Thielen currently is in his career. And he's basically the only guy that they could possibly lean on. The offensive line's still not what it needs to be. It's some young guys that are figuring it out. They're still getting chemistry together. And the game kind of looked like it should, if you take a realistic look at where the Panthers are. Now, that's not to say it can't look better. I think that it can. But some people were getting way ahead of themselves when they're like, hey, why not the Panthers in the NFC South?
Right.
Okay, sure, it's not exactly the most established division, but the why not is right in front of you on the depth chart. You were trying to believe a lot of the best of, and maybe that manifests itself in the second half of the season. They become a more competitive football team. I'd love to see it. But it just felt as though when people were watching that game last night, and I felt this from the Twitter timeline as well, maybe it's just because I follow a lot of Panthers people from living here, but it felt like people were really disappointed to the point where there was almost like a feeling of regret. And I don't think that you need to be there yet. I really don't. I think the Panthers are going in the right direction, but it doesn't matter how long you've been rebuilding as a team. If your roster still says that you're rebuilding, guess what? You're rebuilding. It's not this formula where, all right, we rebuild for 3 years and then we paid our dues and then in year 4, we're going to be really good. If the roster's not good by year 4, you're not going to be good. And I think that's where the Panthers are right now. And I think they kind of need to, that's got to be the expectation of it. A lot of people were just so down after what Bryce has done over the last 2 weeks. It's like, man, come on. It's 2 games into the guy's career. The team and the offense are not good around him. Give him a little bit of time to figure it out. So honestly, that was my big takeaway from last night.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, look, Bryce Young doesn't look good, but it's also quite clear that he doesn't have much help around him. And It's like a walking case study of this difficulty of how do you get the next quarterback without selling the things you need for the next quarterback to be successful along the way. Like the Carolina-Chicago trade is this fascinating dynamic where Chicago were willing to take the receiver to stay with Justin Fields, and then Carolina was willing to give up the receiver in order to go get Bryce Young, but Bryce Young now needs that receiver. Like, Bryce Young is suffering for the absence of DJ Moore, which was required to get him in the first place. So there's this very difficult catch-22 situation that teams are dealing with where in order to be bad enough to get that number 1 pick, to get the QB, you probably don't have the situation around that guy in order for him to have any kind of success right away. And now, look, maybe that's just what you have to suffer through in order to have long-term success, right? Like, 2023 is going to stink for Bryce Young because he doesn't have help. But as long as you don't break Bryce Young along the way, and I'm not just talking physically, as long as you don't damage him with this year of struggling, Next year is when you can go find him a number one receiver and help his offensive line improve. And the young guys on that line just getting better will probably improve as well. And then year 2 is where you start to reap the benefits of having secured the Bryce Young thing in the first place. But it does mean that first year is probably going to be a grind. And I think, it's only 2 games, but we're probably seeing that from Bryce Young right now.
Yeah, you don't draft Bryce Young number 1 overall to go 2-0. You draft him to hopefully be your franchise quarterback for multiple contracts, certainly going into a second contract. And so even though, of course, you would love for him to hit the ground running as fast as he possibly can, that doesn't mean that he's necessarily already this bust, even if we're seeing real struggles for him. I'm not trying to make every excuse in the world for Bryce Young. I know we liked him a lot here at PFF. I know a lot of other outlets clearly did as well. But with Young, I think that you made a great point, and that's what the most important part is about this year. Young's best attribute was never physical ability. It was always mental. And right now, that's a detractor of the success for his game. We saw it last night. He wasn't dealing with pressure super well. The NFL game is clearly a lot faster than he's used to because he got caught from behind in situations where guys were coming up from behind and he was it was rolling out. There was that there was the play where I think Carl Granderson came up behind him and strip sacked him, even when he had 2 hands on the ball. And it's like, okay, now you are understanding NFL speed and strength here. There were a couple of opportunities where he took a sack instead of throwing it out of bounds because all of a sudden the defender was in his face quicker than he believed they were going to be. And so those are things that absolutely are going to take time. The best attribute of him was always how he processed the game. And he's now going through the growing pains of understanding how fast this league is. He did so certainly in week 1 when Jesse Bates picked him off twice over the middle, and he did last night when it came to getting hit and taking sacks in the backfield. So it's going to be a journey with Bryce Young. And I agree with you, help and better receivers, better offensive line, that all goes into it. But truly the most important thing is genuinely just time. Because I would tell you that even with better wide receivers, a lot of the struggles that we saw last night from Bryce Young would probably still exist. Now, there are plays that other guys would get open. Maybe the ball comes out of his hands a little bit quicker. But adjusting to how fast these defensive linemen are getting after him, he would still be going through that even if he had better receivers. So this is all part of the journey of drafting a player like Bryce Young, and I think that they just need to realize that and be patient with it.
It makes the adjustment more difficult. The fact that he doesn't have any receivers that are clearly getting open. I mean, we talk all the time, particularly Alabama. The difference between Alabama open and NFL open is it's like rewiring your brain. It's a different picture that you have to deal with. But it must be exponentially harder to coach a quarterback about what that difference is when you don't even have NFL open. Now you just got guys that are covered, right? So now you're like, look, theoretically this guy should at least be, have the right leverage, and that's open in the NFL. As it turns out, it's not even open in the NFL, but I'm going to need you to put the ball in the air anyway, because otherwise you're going to get killed by the 265-pound defensive lineman that's bearing down upon you.
The second half of this season is where you can, in my opinion, really start to fairly evaluate Bryce. Because, this first year is probably going to be difficult, but to me, it has to look better the second half of the season. If it doesn't look better second half of the season when it comes to feeling NFL edge rushers, knowing when and where he can throw the ball, know the difference between NFL open and Alabama open. If it doesn't look better the second half of the season, then you start to worry a little. Bit. Then I think that criticism is warranted. Basically, the whole first half of this season for him, I don't really care. I really don't care, just because it's a massive transition for him going from what he had at Alabama to now what he's got in Carolina.